Hello, my name is Jonathan Diaz. I am Senior Legal Counsel for Voting Rights at Campaign Legal Center, or CLC, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's book discussion, Turning the Tide of Disinformation, a conversation with Rick Hasen, with Trevor Potter, CLC's president, and Rick Hasen, Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, co-director of the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center, and author of the new book, Cheap Speech: How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. CLC is a national, nonpartisan organization that works to advance democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels. We fight for every American's right to participate in the democratic process. We believe that our democracy should be transparent, accountable, and inclusive. During today's discussion, our speakers will discuss the prevalence of disinformation in our political discourse over the last few decades and explore ways that we can reduce its prevalence to help maintain a healthy democracy. Now it's my pleasure to introduce CLC founder and president, Trevor Potter. Trevor is a former Republican chairman of the Federal Election Commission and served as general counsel to the 2000 and 2008 presidential campaigns of Senator John McCain. He is perhaps best known for his recurring appearances on The Colbert Report as the lawyer for Stephen Colbert's super PAC, Americans for a Better Tomorrow, a program that won a Peabody Award for Excellence in reporting on money in politics. He's joined by Rick Hasen, who is the Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine, and co-director of the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center. He is a nationally recognized expert in election law and campaign finance regulation, and also writes in the areas of legislation and statutory interpretation, remedies, and torts. He writes the often quoted election law blog, which the ABA Journal named to its Blog 100 Hall of Fame in 2015. And additionally, he is the author of over 100 articles on election law issues, published in journals including the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, and Supreme Court Review. Rick's op-eds and commentaries have appeared in prominent publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. And in 2020, he was my colleague at CNN, where he served as an election law analyst for the 2020 election cycle. Before I turn it over to Trevor to kick off the discussion, I want to review a couple of housekeeping items. First, please use the comment section on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, or whatever platform you're using to watch to submit questions for Trevor and Rick. At the end of the discussion, we'll do our best to get to each question, but given time constraints, we may not be able to answer all of them. So if we're not able to answer your question today, members of the press can email their questions to media@campaignlegal.org, and members of the public can email their questions to info@campaignlegal.org. And now I'll turn it over to Trevor.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much. It's a great pleasure, Rick, to have you here today at CLC virtually. Rick and I last saw each other a little over 2 years ago when he was on a tour and in Washington, and then the world changed, and so we've only seen each other on video since then. Look forward to meeting again in person. Rick has made great use of those 2 years and is the author of this new book that has just come out, Cheap Speech: How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. So I look forward to unpacking that with Rick today. We will examine how over the last several years, lower barriers to entry have made it easier for Americans to disseminate content to anyone. And unfortunately, that includes false and misleading content about our elections. So we're going to talk about Rick's book and how legal and private and individual actions can each help ensure that Americans have access to and can rely upon fact-based information so that we can participate in our democracy and identify falsehoods and lies as they appear. So, Rick, let me start with what seems to me an obvious question. Why the title? Why cheap speech? What does what are you driving at, and what are your thoughts about why you picked that?
Well, thanks, Trevor, for the opportunity. It's great to be back with you. I do hope that the next time there's a book or another thing for us to talk about, that we can do it in person. But I've so appreciated your work and the work of CLC over the years in helping to promote a democracy that respects both free speech as well as fair democratic institutions. And that's really what the book is about. So the term cheap speech is not my term. It actually comes from a law review article that was written by Professor Eugene Volokh of UCLA back in 1995. And he was writing as the internet was just blossoming. And he was writing about what was going to happen with an information revolution. He correctly foresaw the rise of things like Netflix and Spotify, the fact that in the palm of our hands, we would have a device that would let us literally have the knowledge of the world available with some taps of our thumbs. And it was a very positive view of what the world was going to look like. And he recognized, Professor Volokh recognized, that we were going to lose certain intermediaries that helped us to separate fact from fiction, that helped us to make sense of the world. To think of the news media. Back in the 1980s, if you didn't like something in the New York Times, you would write a letter to the editor, an op-ed, submit it to the New York Times, and if they didn't publish it, that was pretty much the end of it. You could tell your friends, you could write letters to people, but you really couldn't get your ideas out. And now, without intermediaries, anyone can post just about anything online for people to read. So that's the positive side of things. But I think that there's also been a negative side of things, particularly in terms of democracy in our elections. And so at the beginning of cheap speech, I talk about cheap speech in a separate sense of the word, a system that values lower quality speech over higher quality speech. And let me give you the prime example that the book opens up with, which is the January 6th insurrection in the United States Capitol. I believe that if we had the same polarized politics of today, but the technology of the 1950s, it would have been much, much, much less likely that we would have had a situation where we would have had the insurrection, where millions of Trump supporters would believe the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen. And according to a recent CNN poll, 59% of Republican voters say that believing the claim that the 2020 election was stolen is an important part of what it means to be a Republican. And so we're in a situation now where the absence of intermediaries has allowed someone like Trump, who went to Twitter directly to millions of people 400 times in the 21 days after Election Day, to make false claims that the election was stolen. And so this kind of atmosphere runs the risk of undermining integrity of our elections, because the election process requires people to believe the election was fair, to grumble if they lose, but accept the results as fair and agree to fight another day. Our whole democracy is in danger when millions of people believe this cheap speech.
So, as you point out, and as the professor's article did now a while ago, more than 20 years, there was a very optimistic view of the ability to communicate without having to take out full-page ads or do 30-second spots on TV. The thought was that it was going to lower the costs, which it has, of political speech, which would be a good thing for elections, that candidates would be able to communicate and reach voters much less expensively. So I guess two thoughts on that. One is, I take it what you're saying is that while candidates might be able to reach voters less expensively, everyone else can reach everyone else without cost also, and without an obvious filter. And so if I got that right, and I'm also just curious as we walk past this, why haven't the costs of elections gone down if there's all this cheap speech?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me talk about the incentives that are created in our current environment. So in the old days, if you tried to make it in politics, you would try to curry favor with congressional leadership or leaders within your political party, and you try and work your way up and maybe get some campaign cash coming from the party. Today, you can go directly to voters to fundraise. You can put a video on Facebook or any other platform and try and make your case. But what ends up happening in our polarized environment is that there is a premium paid for being outrageous and extreme. And so someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is among the most extreme politicians in the United States, is able to fundraise really well because she says outrageous stuff and she attracts money directly. She doesn't need to rely upon the political party. Many in the Republican Party would rather that she not be part of the Republican Party. And yet here she is as one of the top fundraisers. What we have in the country now is a situation where we have very strong polarization, but very weak political parties. And so the political parties can't do what they have done in the past, which is use the powers that they have, financial and otherwise, to rein in more extreme elements within their party and to bring the parties back to the center. And so I think that is really worrisome. Now, why haven't costs gone down? Well, we've gone from a trickle of speech to a fire hose, and trying to get people's attention during that time is hard to do. It's expensive because you have to break through all of the noise. That requires, even though we have lots of different ways of communicating on television, especially on live sports broadcasts, that becomes a way of reaching people in a way that is still expensive. And people have their devices in front of them. So you're going to try and reach them that way as well. And there are whole industries that have developed trying to use new technologies on social media and otherwise to try to communicate with people. And there are professionals out there. So while everyone can speak, when everyone is speaking, it can be expensive to break through.
So there are two different models that get referred to in general for how ideas get disseminated and what happens. One is the marketplace of ideas, which I think inherent in that phrase is the concept that in the marketplace of ideas, the truth will win out over falsehood, that the better product, the truth, will somehow rise to the top. Then there is the other phrase, Gresham's law, I believe, which is that bad will drive out good. So sort of the opposite. In the marketplace, somehow the true stuff ends up at the bottom of the heap and buried. Which is happening here, and how do you see that playing out in terms of communications about politics today?
Well, I think it's a really important question, in part because the United States Supreme Court, which decides about the constitutionality of different laws that regulate the election process, very much buys into the marketplace of ideas. I don't think the marketplace of ideas ever truly represented how things work, that the remedy for speech that is false or bad is always counter speech, that the truth will rise to the top. And again, I'll use the primary example of the January 6th insurrection and current beliefs about the 2020 election being stolen as a perfect way of thinking about this. And in fact, I had completed the manuscript of my book before the January 6th insurrection, warning that dangerous false claims about election integrity could lead to violence. And then I had to rewrite the book because it actually did lead to violence. I think that if the truth rose to the top, then people would have rejected the idea that the 2020 election was stolen. In fact, in my last book, which you and I talked about 2 years ago, Election Meltdown, I was worried that we were going to have a poorly run election and it was going to create fodder for talk about rigged and stolen elections. I mean, the writing was already on the wall. Then we had the pandemic. I was even more worried because it's so hard to run an election in the middle of a pandemic. And yet we had a remarkably clean election. And I think all the available evidence indicates that our last election was done in a fair way and that the results reflect how voters voted in every state. And Joe Biden won the states that he won, and Donald Trump won the states that he won as declared by Congress. And yet millions of people don't believe that. So I don't see how we can talk about a marketplace of ideas. It didn't even matter that there was nothing that went wrong with our election. But when you have someone who's a demagogue, when you have either a political or financial incentive to lie, and to be able to speak directly. I mean, imagine if in the 1950s, Donald Trump came to the presidential podium 400 times over 21 days to make false claims about the election being stolen or rigged. He just wouldn't have the ability to keep repeating that and get access directly to the public about those ideas. And so I think that now in this atmosphere, it's really not true that speech rises to the top. And I don't want to get ahead of our questions, but this has implications for how the Supreme Court should think about laws that regulate political speech. Because if counter speech doesn't necessarily work, then there should be mechanisms in place to assure that voters have better access to true information. That doesn't mean censorship. I'm not in favor of censorship, but it does mean things like improved disclosure laws, which we can talk about.
So you've mentioned the role here of former President Trump, and I think that is an interesting question because I guess how does that fit in? He has the biggest megaphone, the president generally, of almost anyone. He obviously was able to amplify everything through social media, and arguably may have a somewhat smaller megaphone now that he's not tweeting all the time and finding it as inexpensive to communicate. But yet clearly we'd be in a totally different world if he had accepted the election results or simply not gone on and on and on lying about who had won and creating false information. So is it the fact that the president was doing this that's the problem as opposed to the medium? Or do you think the medium then magnified it in a way that it just wouldn't have been pre-internet?
Well, of course, it took both of those things. But I think the point that I'm trying to make in the book is that it's just a much easier path for a demagogue to try to undermine election confidence than it would have been in the past. And what you see, if you look at social science studies, which I do in part of the beginning of the book, if you look at social science studies about who is spreading false information, it turns out there are really a very small group of elites, not just the president, but others around the president and certain people in the same kind of information environment. Donald Trump Jr., Alex Jones of InfoWars, Roger Stone, right? There are certain characters that we've come to learn about over the last 6 years that become super spreaders of misinformation. And some of them are motivated for political power. Some of them are also motivated for financial reasons. You may remember that Donald Trump, and this is something that you at CLC have been following very closely, Donald Trump used his false claims about the election in the aftermath of the election to raise funds for what he said was a fund for recounts. But in fact, if you read the fine print, and I think CLC was one of the first out of the box to talk about this, if you read the fine print, 90% of that money at one point was going to essentially a slush fund, a leadership fund that he could use to fund all kinds of personal things for his benefit. There was also a story this week in the New York Times based on an upcoming book about Alex Jones and InfoWars, that Alex Jones was making about $55 million a year in profits from selling things like vitamins and body armor and other products as he was peddling lies about the election and other things. And there really is a profit motivation for many of those who are spreading these lies. And so Donald Trump has maybe unlocked the kind of the secret path to doing this, but he's not likely to be the last one to try and attempt to do this. And we do see what I'd consider mini Trumps doing very similar kinds of things. And that really lies about the integrity of the election are especially dangerous because democracy depends so much on public faith in the electoral process. And believing that elections are being stolen might make you more willing to participate in stealing the next one.
Or just less likely to vote and participate because you think it's rigged.
Oh, yes, right. It can certainly, and that a big part of what I talk about in cheap speech is the demobilizing effect, sometimes deliberately. So you could think of either the Russians that pretended to be Black activists who told people in 2016 not to vote for Hillary Clinton because she wasn't doing enough for the African American community, or supporters of Doug Jones, the Democrat who was running in the special Senate race in the U.S. Senate race in Alabama in 2017, who falsely posed as Baptist teetotalers supporting a full ban on alcohol and tried to tie that to Roy Moore in an effort to suppress the vote of moderate Republican voters in Alabama, and that may have worked. So yes, certainly this kind of cheap speech can be used to demobilize people and to suppress votes.
So that leads to the obvious question and an important part of your book, which is, all right, we've identified the problem. What do we do about it? In your book, you propose sort of two separate types of solutions, some law-based and others private action-based. So we're used to thinking that laws solve the problems. I guess this is a two-pronged question. What legal solutions do you think work given current Supreme Court precedent? And then why isn't that enough?
Right. So, there are a lot of legal steps that could be taken if Congress had the will and the Supreme Court was willing to uphold it. First and foremost, something that's near and dear to your heart is improved disclosure on the internet, things like the Honest Ads Act or the Disclose Act. Right now, if someone gets a TV ad for a candidate that runs through their cable box or their DirecTV satellite dish, it's subject to certain disclosure rules. But if that same signal comes from Hulu coming through the internet or through YouTube or Facebook, it doesn't. And that's a ridiculous system. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, as it's become much more conservative, has started to signal that disclosure laws might be subject to stricter constitutional scrutiny. I'm thinking of last term Supreme Court decision, Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta. Another example of a kind of law that I would favor has to do with deepfakes. Deepfakes are artificial intelligence based means of manipulating audio or video. You can imagine one that would make a political candidate appear to be in some sexually compromised position or be uttering a racist epithet or be having a health crisis. My solution to how to deal with this is not censorship. I don't think these videos should be illegal, but I do think that there should be a mandate that they be labeled altered, whether they're satire or they're serious or whatever. Label them altered so that voters will have better context to know that they are not seeing something that is legitimate. And yet, the Supreme Court's compelled speech doctrine and the Supreme Court's disclosure doctrines, both based on what I consider to be the outmoded marketplace of ideas approach to the First Amendment, mean that the court might not strike these laws down. But let me say one more thing about the Supreme Court and its rules here before turning to the private side. You might think that the conservatives on the court would be fully for deregulation and unfettered speech. This is how Justice Clarence Thomas, one of the most conservatives on the court, has written opinions for years, believing that even campaign finance disclosure laws violate the First Amendment. Well, Justice Thomas has come out in a concurring opinion, a case that didn't even raise the issue, but just gratuitously offered his opinion that the state of Florida or other states should be free to pass laws that would require social media companies to carry the speech of politicians that they don't like. So Facebook could be forced by Florida under Justice Thomas's view to carry the speech of someone who undermines the integrity of the elections or who even promotes violence. And that's pretty breathtaking for someone like Justice Thomas to take this pro-regulation approach, one that would tell a private company, say, if you're Fox News or The Atlantic, you can decide what content you're going to include on your cable news show or on your magazine. But if you're Facebook, that curates content all the time by getting rid of hate speech, getting rid of pornography, promoting some content, demoting other content, you can't decide to exclude Donald Trump. And so I think from both ends, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence could stand in the way of laws that would make it easier for voters to get reliable information and become less likely to be taken in by lies about the election. But because those laws are not likely to pass in a polarized Congress, and because some of those laws, if they passed, could be struck down by the Supreme Court, I do believe we need to think about private action as well. I'll just mention one of them now, the decision to deplatform Donald Trump. I wrote about this in a piece that I had in the Washington Post earlier this week. You may remember that after the January 6th insurrection, both Twitter and Facebook removed Donald Trump from their platforms after experimenting with labeling his election-related speech as false or to get more information about it. They decided it was too big of a risk. And Twitter had a permanent ban on Trump. Facebook had a permanent ban until its oversight board that it created to give it advice on how to deal with these speech issues said you need to impose a time and you need to explain when someone could get back on if they're deplatformed. And Facebook has said that by January 7th, 2023, Trump could be back on unless he's found to have been still engaging in conduct that could undermine elections. And I don't believe that we can have a law that says political candidates that undermine elections must be removed from platforms. I don't think the First Amendment would allow that, and I don't think that's a good idea, because we wouldn't want a government bureaucrat who could be under political sway of whatever president we don't like making those decisions. But I do think that we as consumers, we as members of society can try to push and pressure these companies. This is what I mean by private action, in order to keep someone who is consistently, as you mentioned, Donald Trump is still doing. He's still falsely claiming that the election was stolen, still making claims that the election was rigged and asking to decertify the presidential election of 2020, which is not a thing. He's still dangerous for our democracy. And I think these private companies should make a decision to keep him off their platforms.
But if I heard you right, and I want to go back to this because I had missed the Justice Thomas comments. If I heard you right, you said that Justice Thomas, at least, thinks that it would be permissible to tell these private companies that they can't keep someone off their platform. Now, we had for many years equal time rules for broadcasters, where the government told broadcasters that if they put one candidate on, they had to put the other candidate on. Those were eventually removed by the Federal Communications Commission, but there was a significant debate about whether they were, in what I would call the modern world, constitutional, because they had been put on when there were very few channels. The government gave out licenses, and it wanted to make sure that voters, citizens, heard all points of view in those very few channels. Then we moved to 100 cable channels, hundreds of cable channels, and the argument was that it was no longer constitutional to tell these private companies who they could or couldn't put on the air or had to put on the air, because there was now so much choice. There was no longer the argument that there was this tiny spigot that the government had licensed. And all through that, of course, newspapers were never covered by that, or in cases where the government tried to tell newspapers what they could or couldn't print, those were found unconstitutional. So with that background, what is the argument that says that Justice Thomas is making, or what is the argument that the courts might come to that says, no, actually, you can order a private entity to publish particular things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should say that these ideas of equal time or the fairness doctrine in the past are things that Justice Thomas has criticized as not consistent with the First Amendment. And those rulings were premised, as you said, on the scarcity of the broadcast spectrum. There were only so many television stations you could have. And today, of course, we have an infinite variety of channels on not just cable television, but YouTube, TikTok, wherever you might want to get your videos. And you're also right that in the past, the court had not applied this to newspapers. The most important case here is a case called Tornillo. That's a case where Florida had a law that said that a candidate who was criticized had the right to reply, and the Supreme Court said, no, that's not consistent with the First Amendment. Newspaper is a private entity; it gets to decide what to do. And the Supreme Court, as recently as a couple of years ago, in a case called Halleck, said that a public access cable provider did not have to provide equal time or equal access to someone that was being criticized. So, what could be the theory that would allow a state like Florida to pass a law as it has that mandates, must carry for political candidates? The theory is, and it's one that Professor Volokh, the person who named cheap speech, has been at least tentatively endorsing. It's a theory of common carriers. So the telephone company, if you go to Verizon or AT&T to get a phone, they're not allowed to say, well, sorry, you believe in white supremacy, you don't get a phone. We require that certain, like public accommodations, we require that certain common carriers provide access to everyone. And the reason that we do that is that those entities are not in the speech business, right? They're providing you with technology, or they're providing you with housing, or they're providing you with transportation. The argument of Thomas and of Volokh and of some others is, well, Facebook's doing the same thing. It's just like a utility that is providing you with access to the ability to post your content. And I think that that's where it's fundamental. And so they can be mandated without violating the First Amendment to carry, just like to take the Prune Yard case, a shopping mall can be mandated to allow petitioners to come onto their property to be able to collect petitions, which is something that I don't think Justice Thomas supported in the past in any case. But today, are Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, are they like telephone companies? I think they're much more like newspapers and like cable television stations. They decide what content to include, right? If Facebook and Twitter didn't provide any moderation, our feeds would be filled with hateful talk. It would be filled with talk of violence. It would be filled with pornography. Nobody would want to go to these sites. And so, of course, they curate content and they decide what gets promoted. They have a fancy computer algorithm that tells them for each user what content is promoted, what content is demoted. I mean, think about it. If, let's say that Facebook decides to re-platform Donald Trump, that's going to send a message to people. Or they decide not to re-platform Donald Trump, that's going to send a message. They are, whether they want to call themselves publishers or not, for purposes of the Communications Decency Act of Section 230, they are curating content. And so I think it's fundamentally wrong, and it's dangerous to have a law that says no matter what the politician says, you've got to include their speech. I mean, remember what happened before January 6th. Trump tweeted repeatedly, come to Washington on January 6th. It's going to be wild. We're going to have wild protests. He says you need to go over there being the capital, and tell people that you're not going to take it anymore. We're not going to have a country anymore. That was such dangerous speech. And so that should be excludable by these private companies.
So you've mentioned what it seems to me is a extra layer of complexity in this discussion, which is the famous Section 230. And for our listeners, that's the piece of the communications laws that says that internet sites, and you can correct me if I'm misstating this, but that Facebook and Twitter and everyone else are exempt from being sued from the libel laws and so forth for what people post on them, for the content, precisely because they're not making decisions. In that sense, they're not publishers in the way that newspapers are. So if I write a letter to a newspaper and I include false and defamatory statements and the newspaper publishes it, I may be liable, but the newspaper may too for running it. And Facebook and the rest of the internet said, well, we don't have the ability to control the vast number of people speaking all the time, every second. And so if we're held liable, we couldn't operate. And so that, it seems to me, changes this debate a bit. I mean, to start with, I suppose there's a question of whether Congress could say, okay, we're going to continue to give you this exemption and protect you, but in return, you have to do the sorts of things that television stations have to do. You have to provide access to every candidate, or give rebuttal time or things like that. So that'd be one way to go. But the other way to go would be to say, wait a minute, you can't claim an exemption because you're not a publisher and then act like a publisher and curate the content. So how do we think our way through that one?
Well, first I should point out, I don't have a general theory of Section 230, which there are all kinds of issues, putting up non-consensual sexual imagery that leads to so-called revenge porn, right? That's a huge issue. Speech related to children and harms to children. So the Section 230 question is a huge one. And as I say at the beginning of the book, I can't tackle all of that here. I'm just focused on our elections. But your question is a good one, but I thought it was worth leading with that. There is another part of Section 230 which says that there's no liability for excluding content. And so when Florida passes this law, not only would it have to show that its law is constitutional, and a court has preliminarily found in a preliminary injunction that it's not, but you'd also have to argue that that part of Section 230 is unconstitutional, and because it's preventing the states from regulating this kind of conduct. It's a very difficult legal question as to whether or not Congress could mandate some kind of must carry provision generally. But I think the better argument is that just like these are private companies, just like a cable television station is a private company, these are private companies. And if the only rationale for limiting speech is that if the only rationale for regulating speech and requiring the carrying of speech is scarcity, that just doesn't apply here. I think regardless of what Section 230 says, these are considered to be, I would say, functionally as publishers. They're not writing the posts, but they're deciding which posts appear in someone's feed. So you could square the two and say, there's no liability for writing the individual posts, but there's still a creative aspect to Facebook. So if people go to Truth Social, which is the new Twitter-like company that Trump is behind, that's going to allow posting, people are going to go there and they're going to expect pro-Trump content. Should that site be changed to require equal time and alternative points of view? I think that Truth Social should be able to organize and put out whatever message it wants and promote whatever content it wants. I think that is functionally publishing, whether Section 230 calls it that or not. Now, maybe we could eliminate Section 230 entirely, and then what would you have, as you suggested, the companies would post a lot less speech, right? So it was very odd, and I write about this in the book. Trump was calling for the repeal of Section 230, but if Section 230 were repealed and Facebook and Twitter could be subject to, say, libel laws for the content of what Trump was saying, then they would have been more likely to remove his content sooner. Just think about the defamation lawsuits that have been brought by a few voting machine companies against Fox News, One American News Network, and Newsmax for falsely claiming that the voting machines were being rigged to hurt Donald Trump. It would be the same thing. And I actually think you would have less speech if you repealed that portion of Section 230, and you wouldn't get exactly what it is that Trump thought he would get with the repeal.
So your comments about the Trump social network, this new one, raise an intriguing question to me, which is if the organizations, the large ones like Facebook and Twitter and so forth, do as you recommend and take some responsibility here for ensuring that falsehoods are not predominating in their feeds, then won't that lead to siloing, where other groups will pop up for the purpose of providing a channel to disseminate those falsehoods? I mean, isn't that what Trump is trying to do here, is to create an alternative channel that he controls that will only have his messages and will keep others off? And is that a good thing for us in terms of either how we communicate with each other or for doing anything about the falsehoods about elections?
Great questions. And so, one way of thinking about this is that there's going to be a percentage of the population that is going to believe these false claims, regardless of whatever information you put out about them. And maybe it's better for those people to choose to hide themselves off, because if there's 20 or 30% of people who are believing this false stuff, there's maybe another 20 or 30% who could be persuaded, who will no longer be exposed to this false content as much. And I just saw some stories. The Truth Social is having a bit of a rough rollout in technically, in getting people on, but also there hasn't been much action on there, because much of what those who are trying to promote these false statements are trying to do is to provoke people on the other side and get more polarization and fighting going. That's good for business. That's good for riling up the base and all of that. And so I'm not sure that siloing people into, hiving these people off is actually going to be a social ill. It actually might be a social benefit. I'm not suggesting that there should be any law that would require people going into these silos, but if they do, it actually could have some positive social results. The question is, how do you foster the best environment for voters to be able to make informed choices? And so disclosure is one way. Another proposal that I have in my book is a law that would ban empirically falsifiable statements about when, where, and how people vote. Right now, there's a prosecution of someone who targeted messages to African-American voters in 2016, falsely telling them they could vote by text or social media hashtag. I think we could have a narrow law consistent with Supreme Court precedent that would say that could be illegal. But then what should the policy be beyond that? So Donald Trump is out there lying all the time and saying that the last election was stolen. I don't think we can have a law against making claims that the last election was stolen. That's not protecting voters directly in this process. It would be tough. You could try to make that argument, it would be tough. But I think that the platforms could decide, so long as this creates a danger for the United States, that those who are serial liars and who have large followings make irresponsible claims about election integrity, those people don't deserve to have a platform on these private companies' websites.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a number of viewers out there, and I think some of them have questions. So they may pop up in the chat as we're looking at it. Here's our first one. What has driven you to become involved in the topic of disinformation in the democratic process? Why did you write this book?
So this book actually started off as a law review article at a symposium for the First Amendment Law Review, presented the paper back in 2017. And it was at the moment when Trump was just coming to power in the United States. He had just defeated Hillary Clinton. And I don't know if you remember this moment, you probably do, Trevor, when Donald Trump in 2016 claimed that there was massive voter fraud in the election. And he claimed that there were 3 million people who voted illegally, all for Hillary Clinton, not coincidentally the margin by which he lost in the popular vote, even though he won in the Electoral College. It struck me that demagogic candidates could try to undermine confidence in the fairness and integrity of the election process. And in my last book, Election Meltdown, which dealt with all the ways that elections could go wrong, I had a chapter on incendiary rhetoric and the danger of that. And it struck me at writing that chapter and writing the last book that this is the major information challenge that we face for our democracy going forward, is the threat of disinformation, specifically about elections. And it's a really hard question to ask. You know, I was just at a panel discussion with Nate Persily, who's one of the country's leading experts on law, elections, and tech. And he said, you know, why give the power to Mark Zuckerberg if you're not willing to give it to a government bureaucrat? And it's a really hard question to answer. I'm trying to thread that needle. But I do think if the platforms become too powerful, then the kind of law that we want to use to regulate them is probably not speech law that says you must carry this speech or you can't carry that speech, but antitrust law. That is, and this goes it's the flip side of the question you asked about siloing. I think it might be better if we have more outlets, more ways to communicate over different platforms so that no platform is dominant. And it's not just about social media. Think about Google. Right now, there's no law that would prevent Google from tweaking its algorithms so that if you put in one candidate's name, you get back positive messages. And if you put another candidate's name, you get back negative messages. My solution to that is a requirement of disclosure of how the algorithms are being tweaked. But if you think that that's not good enough because Google is too powerful, then the idea is, well, how do you break up big companies that have so much power rather than telling them directly what they can say or can't say?
It's interesting that you circle back to disclosure here, because that, of course, is one of the areas that CLC has been focused on for a long time. Do you agree with former Justice Kennedy's comments, statements in Citizens United, that disclosure is really central to speech? And Kennedy's argument was that it doesn't matter who's speaking, the more speakers, the better, because voters will get more information. But disclosure is important in terms of the voters knowing who the speaker is. And then Kennedy went on to say a couple things. One, that voters use that information to determine whether to believe the speaker or not. And whether the speaker is credible in their views depends on knowing who the speaker is. And then secondly, that if you know who the speaker is, it is possible to hold them accountable. And the example he gave was, well, if corporate shareholders don't like the speech of a corporation, their shareholders, they can do something about it. You know, whether that's correct or not is a matter of business law. Certainly, you can withhold your purchases if you don't like what a corporation is saying or how it's spending its money, if you know about it. So do you agree with Kennedy that knowing who is speaking is important in at least conversations about elections and democracy for those two reasons?
So I enthusiastically half agree with Justice Kennedy. I think you and I were on the same side in Citizens United, that he got the issue wrong about limiting corporate spending in elections. But given that we're in a world where there's unlimited corporate spending in elections, and I should say one of the reasons I think it's wrong is because Justice Kennedy, along with every other justice on the Supreme Court, unanimously agreed with a lower court decision written by then Judge Kavanaugh in a case called Blumen, that it's totally permissible to ban foreign spending, even of 50 cents, to promote a candidate for office. And so, even they are willing to draw a line. They just draw it in a slightly different place. But putting that issue aside, disclosure is very valuable to voters, not only in preventing corruption or its appearance, and not only in helping to enforce other laws like the ban on foreign spending in elections, but for the very important reason you mentioned of providing voters with valuable information. So just to give you an example, about a decade ago, there was a ballot measure on the ballot in California. We have a lot of ballot measures, vote a lot of technical things that people don't really pay all that much attention to. One proposition was Proposition 10, would have banned public utilities from competing with private utilities under certain circumstances, something about which I probably would not have had much of an opinion without studying it. And what ended up happening was that every advertisement in favor of this measure listed on the advertisement itself, pursuant to California law, the major funders. And the major funder was Pacific Gas and Electric, which was a private utility. And so it was very obvious that this was an anti-competitive measure that PG&E was putting on the ballot to try to stop competition. And even though PG&E backed yes on this measure, I think they outspent the no side 30 million to 1 million. The measure still went down to defeat. And I think that's a very valuable lesson, that voters rely upon accurate information of who is behind the speech in order to assess its credibility. And so voters should be able to know, is this video of this candidate appearing to collapse real, or is it altered? When someone is speaking to me and claiming to be a Black activist worried about Black Lives Matter issues, if it turns out to be a government employee in St. Petersburg, Russia, I think voters would want to know that, and they would use that as a means of credibility. And to take one more example in my book, I think we can have and this goes to the private rather than the government mandated system. I think that private journalists should be creating a kind of accreditation system where if you follow certain journalistic norms, your newspaper or your website gets an accreditation, and then that accreditation symbol could appear on Twitter or on Facebook next to speech that comes from that outlet. That would help voters know, okay, these people are subscribing to a certain set of values. I think disclosure it's not the only thing, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but it's a key part of what we need to do. And it's why I think the work of CLC has been so important in fighting so that we can at least have the disclosure laws on the books now being enforced, much less get improved disclosure laws passed by Congress and approved by the courts.
We're both familiar with the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Do you really think it's enough to allow fake videos up there that have been altered artificially, show somebody stumbling or slurring their speech, or in your example, in a sexually compromising position with somebody, and then just put a little disclaimer that says video altered? Will people get that message?
Well, you have to ask yourself, what's the alternative? And so, the alternative is censorship, is saying you may not produce a video. Well, what if you're producing it for satire? Is a video of Saturday Night Live showing a presidential candidate bumbling? Would that be, where you draw that line? And, it was interesting when my book came out, I had a few op-eds this week. The first one was in the New York Times. And immediately Fox News and the Daily Mail had headlines about my op-ed saying, "Professor supports censorship." And actually, the only time I'm talking about speech being stopped is a narrow ban on when, where, and how people vote, saying Republicans vote on Wednesday. That's going to cover very little amount of the kind of speech that we're worried about. And foreign spending, which the Supreme Court on a 9-0 basis said is perfectly constitutional to limit. But otherwise, most of my solutions are either private solutions or they're about more disclosure. I think beyond that, we run the risk of a government bureaucrat. I mean, think of whatever your political persuasion, think of the president you trust the least having the authority to appoint the communications czar who gets to decide what speech is dangerous and what is not. And I think that's really a risk to our democracy. And so I do think that rather than banning deep fakes, it's better for them to be labeled. And also because we want voters to be able to trust what they see with their eyes. And this will at least give them, as they're seeing a video or listening to something, some cue that maybe I should not take this so seriously.
So we're getting towards the end, unfortunately, of our hour, because I could keep going for a long time on this. This is a great conversation, and the book is wonderful. I've obviously read it, but I encourage everyone else to read it. I think we may have one more audience question ready. And if so, we'll pop it up. So if Congress can't do anything about this, what about state legislatures? You've mentioned, Florida in doing something that you don't recommend, but could individual states do this? How would that work in a national market?
Well, states could certainly regulate their own state elections. So they could require disclosures in their own state elections. And we have seen some of that going on. Washington State has been considering a bill that would make it a crime for a candidate to lie about the last election being stolen after all legal avenues have been pursued. I'm not in favor of such a law because, it might be that there actually is a problem with an election and you can't prove it in law, but maybe a few years later, there is evidence that comes forward. And so I'm really worried about laws that directly say that you can't have a different view about what happened in the past. So that's not very fruitful, I think. California has passed a law, it's only on the books for a few years, that seeks to regulate deep fakes, not quite the way I do, but I do think that those things can help, but they're not going to help in federal elections. For federal elections, we really need to have national legislation, and we need to have a national push on the private side. It's not going to be solved on a state-by-state basis.
Well, that gives us some work to do. Well, Rick, thank you so much for joining all of us today. I do encourage all of our viewers to read the book, Cheap Speech, to learn more about the solutions that can ensure that the public has better access to quality information about our elections and democracy, so that we can be better prepared to make informed decisions, and we don't have citizens believing total lies about our election system and how it works. These are obviously key issues for those of us who care about democracy in this country. If you have any additional questions or would like more information, you can email Campaign Legal Center. It's info@campaignlegalcenter.org. So Rick, great to see you. Thank you for this conversation. Look forward to seeing you in person at some point soon, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you and look forward to continuing the conversation going forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Rick.